So you mentioned the Hollywood folks, maybe people in Silicon Valley, and the vibe shift. Maybe you can speak to preference falsification. What do they actually believe? How many of them actually hate Trump? What percent of them are feeling this vibe shift and are interested in creating the Roaring '20s in the way they've described?
So first, we should maybe talk population. So there's like all of Silicon Valley, and the way to just measure that is just look at voting records, right? And what that shows consistently is Silicon Valley is just at least historically, my entire time there has been overwhelmingly majority just straight up Democrat. The other way to look at that is political donation records, and again, the political donations in the Valley, range from 90 to 99%, to one side. And so, we'll I just bring that up because we'll see what happens with the voting and with donations going forward. We maybe talk about the fire later, but I can tell you there is a very big question of what's happening in Los Angeles right now. I don't want to get into the fire, but it's catastrophic. And, there was already a rightward shift in the big cities in California. And I think a lot of people in LA are really thinking about things right now as they're trying to, literally save their houses and save their families. But even in San Francisco, there was a big big shift to the right in the voting in 24. So we'll see where that goes. But you observe that by just looking at the numbers over time. The part that I'm more focused on is and I don't know how to exactly describe this, but it's like the top 1,000 or the top 10,000 people, right? And I don't have a list, but it's it's all the top founders, top CEOs, top executives, top engineers, top VCs, and then kind of into the ranks, the people who kind of build and run the companies. And they're I don't have numbers, but I have a much more tactile feel, for what's happening. So the big thing I have now come to believe is that the idea that people have beliefs is mostly wrong. I think that most people just go along. And I think even most high status people just go along. And I think maybe the most high status people are the most prone to just go along because they're the most focused on status. And the way I would describe that is, one of the great forbidden philosophers of our time is the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. And amidst his madness, he had this extremely interesting articulation. He was an insane lunatic murderer, but he was also a Harvard super genius. Not that those are in conflict. But
shots fired, man.
But he was a very bright guy, and he did this whole thing where he talked about basically he was very right wing and talked about leftism a lot. And he had this great concept that's just stuck in my mind ever since I read it, which is he had this concept he just called over socialization. And so, most people are socialized. Most people are socialized. Like most people are, we live in a society. Most people learn how to be part of a society. They give some deference to the society. There's something about modern Western elites where they're over-socialized, and they're just overly oriented towards what other people like themselves, think and believe. And you can get a real sense of that if you have a little bit of an outside perspective, which I just do, I think, as a consequence of where I grew up. Even before I had the views that I have today, there was always just this weird thing where it's why does every dinner party have the exact same conversation? Why does everybody agree on every single issue? Why is that agreement precisely what was in the New York Times today? Why are these positions not the same as they were 5 years ago? Right? But why does everybody snap into agreement every step of the way? And that was true when I came to Silicon Valley, and it's just as true today, 30 years later. And so I think most people are just literally I think they're taking their cues from, it's some combination of the press, the universities, the big foundations. So it's basically the New York Times, Harvard, the Ford Foundation, and, I don't know, a few CEOs and a few public figures, and maybe the president if your party's in power, and whatever that is, everybody who's sort of good and proper and elite in good standing and in charge of things and a sort of correct member of let's call it coastal American society, everybody just believes those things. And then the two interesting things about that is, number one, there's no divergence among the organs of power, right? So Harvard and Yale believe the exact same thing. The New York Times and the Washington Post believe the exact same thing. The Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation believe the exact same thing. Google and, Microsoft believe the exact same thing. But those things change over time, but there's never conflict in the moment, right? And so, the New York Times and the Washington Post agreed on exactly everything in 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2020. Despite the fact that the specifics changed radically, the lockstep was what mattered. And so I think basically we in the Valley, we're on the tail end of that in the same way Hollywood's on the tail end of that, in the same way New York's on the tail end of that, the same way the media's on the tail end of that. It's like some sort of collective hive mind thing. And I just go through that to say, like, I don't think most people in my orbit, or, let's say the top 10,000 people in the Valley, or the top 10,000 people in LA, I don't think they're sitting there thinking, basically, I have rocks. I mean, they probably think they have rock solid beliefs, but they don't actually have like some inner core of rock solid beliefs, and then they kind of watch reality change around them and try to figure out how to keep their beliefs like correct. I don't think that's what happens. I think what happens is they conform to the belief system around them. And I think most of the time they're not even aware that they're basically part of a herd.